All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to True Crime Loser. I hope you're doing well. So, folks, today we're going to talk about the trial of Derek Chauvin. Here we are a week later. It gripped the nation. I'm sure you saw, but as of Tuesday of last week, the jury, after one day of deliberation, came back with 3 guilty verdicts for all 3 charges. People were saying 1 day of deliberation seems a little short, but I figured it was coming back fast. The jury had been sequestered in hotel rooms since that Thursday before, and the judge was saying, normally, say a juror's sitting in their hotel room and they're thinking, I want to watch a little bit of the footage. I was thinking about something. I want to compare. Normally, they'd have to go all the way back into the courthouse to have access to the footage. But because of COVID and everything happening, each juror, conveniently, I guess, got a laptop with all of the heart-wrenching footage downloaded onto it so they could have it with them in their hotel room. And I was thinking, man, that's a long 3 weeks to be a juror on this one. You're sitting there day after day watching the brutal footage over and over again, but thinking to yourself, this is important. There is a lot riding on this. I have to do my duty and get this right. And then it's finally wrapping up and you're headed into the long weekend, and the only thing you can do is go to the lonely hotel room where the only thing you have is the footage laptop. It's like, can someone slide a couple movies under the door or something? I was really hoping to watch something a little bit lighter before bed, but that's all right. The footage really is the quintessential piece of evidence in this case. I'm thankful it exists. It really roots everything in the reality of the footage. Neither side can go too far off, because if they do, the other side just pulls up a picture or a clip, and they had the ability to circle it like sports announcers. I was thinking of the Casey Anthony trial. You couldn't have anything out of left field. Like, the Casey Anthony trial was going along. All right, here we are, a new day. And out of nowhere, they were like, yeah, she didn't do it because she was molested by her dad. And everyone's like, what? This one with the footage, maybe the carbon monoxide angle way later in the case is a little bit something like that, a Hail Mary. But, it really is the footage, and then you can bring in all the experts you want. But really, at the end of the day, I think most people have it built-in standard issue to be able to watch footage like that and to be able to go, all right, reasonable, sad but reasonable, real sad but unreasonable, unreasonable, assault. That's definitely assault. And so it became a trial of the dueling experts, like an expert from this side and then an expert says the other thing from that side. And the thing about trials that are full of experts is half of the expert has to be their credibility, right? So every witness that comes up is this long-winded, 20-minute, when they start the questioning, you got to establish their credibility, or what are they even doing there? So when you watch the whole thing uncut on the live stream, it got real slow, because it's like they got to go over each expert's full career history. I was editor of the Expert magazine in 1972. They're going through the whole thing. If it's just an eyewitness that's not an expert, it goes way faster. If they're just like, this is Tammy, she lives in the trailer across the street, let's go with the questioning. So it moves really at slow pace, getting all these experts, their credibility out there. And something that struck me, whenever I watch a full one like this, just on the uncut live stream, and I watched pretty much from halfway point when the defense took over in real time, I just would throw it on the stream at 10 a.m. and that'd be the day. And then I had family in town when it started, so then this week I went back and watched a lot of the prosecution's case. But whenever I watch a full trial like this, which I don't think a big percentage of the population will never do it, but whenever I do, I'm always blown away with how much tedious, dull work goes in that will never make the highlights at the end of the day. How much meticulous work goes in to at least attempt to make the thing as fair as possible. One, because hopefully we live in a moral society, so Chauvin deserves to get a fair shake. But two, you don't want to do the whole year's worth of work to just have the thing thrown out at the very end because some I wasn't dotted. I mean, the whole thing is so sensitive, but just with all of the displacement that it takes and the work. If you go back a year, you got to have a grand jury. That's probably 20 people. You need a quorum. That's probably 20 people yanked out of their life for a week or two. People have jobs and things they got to do. Everyone at that time was eating a COVID sandwich financially in some way anyway. So that's 20 people that got to go and hear the whole thing. And then I'm sure the selection process for the petit jury was just a total nightmare. I honestly can't believe they ever agreed. Both sides agreed finally to, all right, here's the jury, because with this one, because of the footage, it feels like it really is just going to come down to the jury. What do they think when they watch the footage? You can have experts all day, but that feeling that you get when you watch the footage is going to be hard to deter. So you got the selection process is really important. That took forever. And then just the logistical nightmare of the trial. All these little things come up. It takes 20 minutes every time. And then you get all the way to the end. And this just shows how sensitive it is. Pretty much on the very last day of arguments, they're talking about the carbon monoxide test that wasn't done, but there's an oxygen test that was done, but that oxygen test hadn't been put into evidence, and it was the last day, and the judge is going, okay. You can call up the witness again and talk broadly about oxygen saturation. But that test hadn't been brought up. So if this witness even accidentally brings up that test, it's a mistrial. The whole thing is done. So that just shows you how sensitive the whole thing, after the whole year of displacement and bringing the witnesses in, they're crying, it's a tough day for them, and the lawyers are putting their whole life's work into everything, and they're figuring out the whole thing. And to get to the very end and have Maxine Waters come out and put the whole thing at risk by just being like, I need to feel relevant and say something, put myself on camera to say something. It was a strange feeling to watch, 50 hours of it and have the kind of end with the judge. He's sitting there, he looks sick. He's looking at the defense table with Chauvin and the attorney, and he goes something like, it's not like anybody really cares about what some congresswoman has to say, but she probably did give you something for appeal. I mean, think about that. I really don't. I hope and I really don't think what she did is enough to get him a whole new trial. But think about if Chauvin gets a whole new trial and the reason cited, or one of them, is Maxine Waters' name. That honestly will go down as one of the biggest tanks I've ever seen an elected official do regarding an ongoing trial. It's just like, Maxine, keep your mouth shut for a day or two. You could say whatever you want once it's done, but man, talk about just being self-centered and not thinking like, man, this whole process was quite an ordeal. Maybe I should just let the whole thing play out before I have to insert my ego into the whole thing. But like I said, hopefully it wasn't enough to do anything. Because just from where I was sitting and watching pretty much the whole thing, it did feel like a fair shake. So to just have this one flushed down for something so small, it just seems a little bit sad. All right, so let's get into the actual trial. We'll start with prosecution. It's pretty simple. There was a lot of like, what you saw happened, saying, all right, if you watch the footage and you think that that's unreasonable, then that's okay. You have the ability as a human being to take in situations and trust that feeling. I would say the most powerful witnesses they called were just all the law enforcement officers, right? I think they had 8 that were saying, no, that's absolutely not the way you hold prone position. That's prone position, which anyone that watched the trial, you became an expert in prone position. That's where when it's going terrible in some way, it's like, all right, let's go to the ground, regroup. But there's all these, you go to the ground and then, obviously there's many ways to hold the person in prone, and none of the officers were saying that it has to be the brutal, prolonged knee with extra mustard directly to the neck, right? And so they're saying absolutely not. And then the woman, I thought it was pretty powerful too, the police trainer woman that actually trained Chauvin testified, and she was like, no, I didn't train that. He was improvising, and I'd never heard that word when it came to police work before. I would always improvise if I was a cop. That sounds great. Like, say I'm driving with my partner in our squad car. My partner's driving, I'm in the passenger seat, and my partner looks over, and I'm just waving my gun out the window. Ow! Yeah! Woo! And he's like, Scott, what are you doing? What are you doing? I'm like, I'm improvising, baby. Ow! I'm going type 2 police work. We're jamming today. But yeah, I had never heard he was improvising. Hell of a disastrous improvise for old Chauvin's life. So I thought the two prosecution attorneys were as top-notch maybe as I've ever seen. Both just, brought it. And I were saying things, I was like, yeah, that is, pretty good. And I just thought they were as good as it gets as far as prosecution goes. And I thought their closing argument was good. It was still just like, it's okay to go with, what you saw is what you saw. Because kind of the whole thing, which we'll get to when I talk about the defense when they took over, the whole thing pretty much came down to reasonable police work, right? That was the word. Is it reasonable? Because if it is reasonable police work, then, it can't be on Chauvin. It has to be that Floyd was unhealthy, had 90% blocked arteries, and was on a little bit of meth and fentanyl, and that whole thing, maybe a little bit of the carbon monoxide, all of that is what unfortunately killed him. But if it wasn't reasonable police work and it was unreasonable or even assault, it had to move into the assault for the second degree murder, then it really doesn't matter if George Floyd is unhealthy and on a little bit of fentanyl and meth, because that just becomes a reason why not to assault people. You never know if the person you're assaulting is where they are on the health spectrum. I think that Chauvin assumed that George Floyd was a totally healthy guy, and as he was losing his temper or saying like, all right, man, if you want to make a big whole show of this and act like you can't breathe and make it hard on us, well, you're going to eat this knee until you calm down. I think he didn't, when Floyd was saying, I can't breathe, I think he thought, all right, they kept saying, well, if you're talking, you're breathing, but that's risky not to, as far as a police officer, it's probably safer to just, even if you think, he's just, making a show of it, let's take every precaution necessary, roll him into, they're supposed to roll the person in prone into side recovery, and they didn't do that, and it just kept going. And it feels to me, watching Chauvin, it's like one of the longest life-ruining mistakes I've ever seen. How many mistakes have we seen on this channel where someone ruins their whole life or ruins their freedom just instantly, quick? It just felt like Chauvin had so much time to just be like, and flip him over. And I really think that if Chauvin just wouldn't have, handled the way he handled it, just held the prone position in a different position, and then when Floyd was saying he couldn't breathe and stuff, to roll him over, even if George would have died the way that the defense was saying that he died, from being unhealthy and, everything that goes with that, I don't think that Chauvin would have been on trial, because as long as he just followed the protocol, and he had every chance in the book, there was that other police officer you can hear on body cam being like, should we roll him over? And he goes, no, keep him here. And the big part of the amount of force that the cops are allowed to use, it's pretty simple. They have this whole thing, but you boil it down, it's real simple. The force they're allowed to use has to be reasonable for the amount of resistance. And as George Floyd's resistance went to zero as, he was dying, the use of force needed to go along with it. And as the footage shows, it doesn't look like it did to, I think, most people. All right, so like I said, I think the prosecution, they were just as solid as a rock. I thought that they put a good case together, and that's really about all I have to say. So, but the most memorable part of the whole trial, for sure, for me, was the defense's case. And the part of the defense's case was when they called the use or the so-called use of force expert. So they get him up there. They got to go through his whole credibility. He's worked in law enforcement a long time. He teaches everybody when to use the taser. And he used a metaphor while he was up there being questioned about how, say a hypothetical police officer is dealing with a hypothetical situation, and someone starts attacking the police officer, and it's an acceptable moment for that police officer to use the taser. They use the taser. When the person get hit with the taser, they fall down, they hit their head on the concrete, and they die. So in that situation, and that's kind of wraps up, that metaphor kind of wraps up with the whole thing the defense is going for. They were saying, okay, if it's reasonable police work and and then that happens, it's really unfortunate and it's really sad, but it was reasonable use of force and something horrible happened, and it's a really hard job to be a cop out there. And so that is kind of, if you want to sum up the defense's case as quickly as possible, that's what they're going for. And like I said, the word reasonable really became the word, especially in this chunk, because if they can get the jury to just, instead of what they were initially thinking when they watched the footage, like, man, that is way too brutal, to just have this use of force expert plant in, like, I know it's sad, but, it was necessary. George Floyd kicked his foot. That's, even pretty deep into the thing, he kicked the foot and the officer bounces back, and that's resistance. So they have to use some sort of force against the resistance. So really they were furiously with every, Chauvin's freedom is on the line, and it comes down to if they can get the jury that's sitting over there to think, all right, it's tough to watch and it's really sad, but was reasonable position for Chauvin to do, and it just is an unfortunate situation, but it wasn't, Chauvin's fault. So they get this use of force expert up there, and I'm pretty glued at this point, because I'm thinking, for me, you can make an argument that going down into the prone is reasonable, even though the prosecution even didn't think that. But you could make an argument, all right, going down into the prone is reasonable, and then there's resistance down there, and then he kicks off one of the officers doing the feet. But what you can't convince me is that that's the only way to hold the prone. I went and looked at every knee, like where the cop uses the knee. I went and looked at everyone on the internet, and none of them look even close to as brutal and just like in that spot for that long. And so I think it's an uphill battle. So I'm sitting there watching the use of force expert, and they're going over his credibility. It's taken forever, but I'm just sitting there waiting. Okay, how are you going to explain the end part as the resistance completely fell off and the knee is still just being jammed in with extra mustard? How is that going to be explained by this use of force expert? He's been training law enforcement for 40 years. I'm all ears. And so they're making their way slowly. The questioning takes forever, and they're making their way. They finally get to, this expert got paid $10,000 to analyze, or $11,400 to analyze this footage for the defense. I'm thinking, damn, how do I get on like the list of people that can get paid to analyze footage? But anyway, so they bring this guy in, and they're going through the footage, through what happened, and I'm sitting there listening. Okay, I'm all ears. How are you gonna explain that end part is reasonable? And they're going, and they get to the prone. Okay, and then there's obviously the strategy. They didn't think that they could explain the brutal extended knee with extra mustard at the end. And so what their strategy was, which I was like, that's kind of, is they got to the prone position, and then they're like, yeah, he was, resisting pretty hard. And so they went down into the prone position. Do you think that's reasonable? And the use of force expert goes, yeah, that's reasonable. And so it's like, no, all right, well, yeah, I think a lot of people aren't going to argue that going down to the prone position was the unreasonable part. And so he just got to, and so was the prone position reasonable? And the guy's like, yep. And he goes, no further questions. I'm out of here. And then, as you can imagine, probably the most memorable part of the entire trial for me is the use of force expert. His name's Barry Brody or Barry Brody, I can't remember, is his cross-examination, because obviously the defense left it out early before most people are going, no, that's the unreasonable part. But also he was during the defense, he's the defense's witness, so he was pontificating and being the expert that he is, and really, and then the prosecution takes over his cross-examination, and there, as you can imagine, only focused really on the knee. And instead of these long, answers, it's more just, it's possible. Yeah, all right. And so I was thinking, again, as they're picking up the cross-examination for this guy, I was glued, going, all right, like, is this use of force expert going to be able to withstand cross-examination? And the answer is no. He just ate it incredibly hard, and he looked like he got hit with a club, and he was doing these little one-word answers. And it's funny, the headline to come out of that day, it's funny to watch the whole thing and then to look at the headlines at the end of the day. The headline at the end of the day was like, use of force expert said the thing was reasonable. And it's like, not really. He said the prone position was reasonable, and he kind of attempted this as hard as he could without ruining his own credibility, because he's supposed to be this expert, at analyzing police footage. So you could tell he's like, I really want to be a good defense witness, but I also don't want to look stupid for my consulting company. So in my opinion, that was like the quintessential part of the witnesses, is the use of force expert's questioning and then his cross-examination. And I brought it up a little bit at that was a big day. And then towards the very end, another memorable defense witness was Dr. Fowler. And he got up there, and his whole job was the defense's main goal was to say it was reasonable police work. I think they failed to do it. And then their second goal was to say George Floyd was so unhealthy and on drugs that he just died probably naturally right there. It's just a coincidence that Chauvin was kneeling on him. So Fowler came in with all of the health stuff specifically, and if there is any, out of left field Hail Mary with this one, it's not totally out of left field, but if there is one for this one from the defense, it's the whole carbon monoxide thing. And I think they probably thought of that, because they bring George Floyd in the ambulance to the hospital, and I guess that there's a test you can do for carbon monoxide levels. Well, that test wasn't done, because I don't think anyone figured it needed to be done. So I feel like the defense, when they're trying to put their case together, was thinking, all right, well, that's a weakness, so we'll say this test wasn't even done. He's laying down there by the exhaust pipe. Maybe that's what killed him. Reasonable police work, sad but reasonable, and then carbon monoxide. And then I mentioned earlier, created the intense moment, because all the witnesses that would testify against what Fowler's saying had already gone home. They didn't do the carbon monoxide test, but what they did do is an oxygen saturation test, and his oxygen saturation levels were at 98%. So they were trying to say, even, we didn't do the other test, but even if he did have carbon monoxide, the most it could be is 2%, which isn't enough to. And so it's like one of the last days of the trial, and that's when the judge goes, all right, well, you can bring up this witness again, but don't bring up the oxygen saturation test, because it hasn't been up so far, and if you do, it's going to be a mistrial. And that was a pretty intense moment, because like I said earlier in the episode, it's a huge production. And to have the whole thing come down to just if a human being misspeaks, which happens all the time, was wild. And then we went to closing arguments. Again, I thought the prosecution just was top-notch. Their closing arguments I felt was really good. I didn't think the defense attorney, I thought that some of his questioning of even his own witnesses was a little bit meandering, and like Dr. Fowler, I could tell what the defense was trying to get forth, but I was thinking, man, you're losing the jury. They're going to fall asleep. get to the, and, but I thought that the defense attorney, whatever he made or whatever he lost for meandering questions and maybe not getting everything he wanted to get out of his expert witnesses, I thought he made up for in the closing arguments. I thought he really did a good job in the closing arguments. Solid closing arguments for both sides. I didn't think that, I figured that he was going to be found guilty on all three charges. Definitely the manslaughter, and I guess the third degree, which has to do with like just being reckless with someone's life. And then that second degree has to do with assault. If you assault someone and they die, even if they're unhealthy, you know, that's second degree murder. Jury came back, and yeah, it was interesting to see Chauvin, his reaction. It was a bummer. The masks really, I think, it's weird with the COVID mask for trial, because a big part of these trials is when things are said, when a witness says something, they show the person. You can see kind of how they're reacting, but he definitely kept the mask on the whole time. But once the guilty verdicts were read, they showed Chauvin, and he just goes like this. And sentencing, I think, is like 7 weeks away or something, so that'll be interesting. The manslaughter, I think, carries around 4 years suggested. The third degree is around 10, and the second degree is around 10. So, what a trial. Anyway, that's all I got. I'm going to cut it off there. Sorry I haven't been around too much, folks. I brutally dislocated this finger. It's just useless and looks pretty just crooked and weird. So hopefully that heals up. But I've been bummed about that, but feeling better. I'll see you soon. I love you all. Why? Starving why? Shamita.